Hello and welcome back to Verbose Mode by TuxCare here live at Spring IO 2025. I promised you I'll do my best to get Ron Johnson, and I got Ron Johnson!
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. And for those kids of you who don't know who Ron Johnson is, the author of Spring Framework, which came to be out of a book.
It did, yes.
Enterprise development without a JB.
Oh, no, that's way too short. The title was Expert One-on-One J2E Design and Development. Even I can barely say it, but somehow the book still sold.
The book still sold because what it said, and it basically said, dear Java enterprise developers, your suffering is over. You don't need a GB anymore.
Yes.
As the one who has Java business components developer for version 1.2 certification, I can relate how great it was.
Enjoyed that time. We tried to help.
How great it was not to be able to write 3 XMLs, 2 interfaces, and 2 classes for a hello world in EJB.
It's pretty crazy times.
And the rest is history, right? That the Spring took Java enterprise development by storm, and we are now, 18 years?
Oh, no,
20 something. 20.
Spring has existed as an open source framework for 22 years.
22.
Over 22 years.
Yep.
If you look at the first code, the earliest code in Spring, and I know this, I'm using Spring every day, and sometimes I step into the code, it's probably, would be June 2001 is the oldest author tag.
So that makes it 24 years.
Yeah.
Still kicking is an understatement.
Yes.
The most successful framework in the Java ecosystem for sure. And obviously for a very good reason, and that's the programming model that actually brings what you need, where you need it, when you need it.
Yes.
That's kind of what the way I feel about it. And it's great to see you back in the community. It's been a while since you've been involved, and you are here with some exciting news.
Yes, I am. So over the last couple of years, I've been very interested in Gen AI because, this is clearly something that is probably the most important thing in our industry since the internet. I don't feel that it's something that I can sit out. I have to, I need to understand this technology. I also need to do whatever I can do, I think, to try to make it more useful. And I think there's been a tremendous gap between promise and reality. Like when we all discovered, 2 years, something like that, 2 or 3 years ago, when we all first used the version of ChatGPT that actually worked, it was pretty mind-blowing, right? You can talk to this thing.
Absolutely.
But I think since then we've seen surprisingly little success in the enterprise. So, there are certainly things that we know that it's amazing for. One way that I put this when I talk about it at conferences is for the personal assistant use case, which is the killer one.
Absolutely.
Maybe I would say it's maybe 90% of the answers are great. 10% are pretty much off base. When you think about that for building business applications, you have really described 1.9. Try to build a business application around 1.9, something that works 90% of the time, basically effectively does not work 100% of the time for building applications.
Not only that, it actually doesn't work 10% of the time by design. This is how it actually should be. The whole idea of a stochastic, not deterministic system is that it generates different results for the same prompt.
Yes, absolutely. So, it presents us with, as application developers, with a whole bunch of problems, some of which are novel and some of which are very much the same as they were 20 years ago. So, the problems that are novel are you're dealing with things that are incredibly unreliable.
Oh, yeah.
Like failure rates, like off the chart.
Oh, yeah.
You're dealing with things that are inherently non-deterministic.
Yeah.
You're also building components where often the communication with the component is natural language. So those things are different.
They are.
But there's still a whole lot of things that are basically the same concerns. Like, how do you get at your enterprise's data? What kind of systems of record do you do? How do you manage transactions? How do you make the other parts of your system scale? So what I find very interesting is the potential that the JVM and the JVM community has to play in this, trying to make this stuff useful.
Okay.
So over the last 10 or 15 years, I've programmed in a lot of languages. I got very into Scala. I then worked at Atomist. We shipped a lot of software on Node, and we used TypeScript, and I really like TypeScript. Then when I got into AI as opposed to Gen AI, probably back in 2019, and of course I wrote a lot of Python because that's the dominant language in that space. But I think when you look at the problems that I've described with essentially making Gen AI business ready, those problems require the skills of people who are more likely to be in the JVM community than the Python community.
This is very interesting because everybody just by default associate AI with Python.
Yes, absolutely. And look, one thing that I do say in talks these days is every developer on the planet needs to know Python. Like, I won't say I love Python. I see for certain things that Python is a great tool. Yeah. And I'm very glad that I'm extremely fluent in Python now.
The good news is that Python is very easy to learn.
Python is, and I mean, there are certainly things that I would build in Python I would never build in Java or even Cotlin.
Yep.
So, for example, now whenever I find myself with a complicated bash script, I rewrite it in Python, and I'm immensely happier because it just feels so much better. But Python is not a great language for building complex software systems.
Enterprise.
There are a lot of things in Python. For example, visibility is not really a thing. Generics are fairly primitive. There's a lot of things that really that we're used to, and Python doesn't handle particularly well. But also, if you look at your business systems, they integrate with a whole bunch of stuff and a whole lot of existing code assets that are way more likely to be on the JVM
in Java,
than in Python.
Yeah.
So, I probably formed the view a year or two ago that I felt that in terms of bridging that gap between promise and reality and making a lot of this stuff useful in businesses, the JVM needs to play a role.
I think that MCP is an attempt to close this gap. And as a server, it's theoretically language agnostic?
Yeah, MCP is language agnostic and it's great. So, my project heavily embraces MCP.
Yeah.
And I think it's good that MCP is getting a lot of attention because, as you say, it's language agnostic. It gives the opportunity for people to share functionality built on different platforms. But MCP is only part of the solution. There are a whole bunch of things that it doesn't address. It doesn't really address discoverability, doesn't address security. And also, I profoundly disagree with the folk who think that you can have an LLM, give it a whole bunch of tools, and it will solve any problem. I think there's a number of problems with that. Firstly, you are dependent on what I call God models. That is problematic in a number of ways. It's problematic environmentally because these things they use a lot of power, they use a lot of water, and that's not good.
And you categorically don't need all this power.
Exactly. So it's problematic environmentally, it's problematic cost-wise. It is also problematic in terms of even the really good models are not entirely deterministic, and even the really good models can get confused if you give them a lot of tools. So I am a strong believer in an agentic model where you are essentially right-sizing your interactions with LLMs. You're having much smaller prompts, you're giving them a very focused set of tools that are probably MCP tools, but they're not like 200 MCP tools. And you then find that some of the time You can use local models, benefit from privacy, host them yourself. So I think it gives you a greater ability to make the whole thing more deterministic, make it potentially more cost effective, and make it safer. So, to me, that agent space is really important. And again, it brings me back to, what do your agentic applications do? They talk to LLMs. They also talk to systems of record, message buses, your existing code assets, and a lot of the things that they do have a much stronger affinity with JVM stuff than they do with Python stuff. One thing that's very obvious once you see it, but a lot of people don't really think, is that the invocation of an LLM is typically through an HTTP call. It's not running in your Python process.
Yeah, of course.
It's
definitely an API call.
It's a simple API call. And now, fortunately, due to the hard work of Spring AI, we now have a great solution for portability across LLM calls. That is something, obviously, where the Python community were ahead of us. You look at, say, when LangChain came out a couple of years ago, Harrison at LangChain managed to get a pretty consistent model across all these models.
Yeah, now it's ported to Java as well, of course.
Yeah,
with
now, with Spring AI, you get that portability, but you also get the fact that you can now use your Spring Beans to expose tools. You can inject into Spring components, other Spring dependencies, expose tools on them. So, you get the stuff that the Python community's had, admittedly for longer, but you get the stuff that they don't have.
And we have it in Java, we have it in Spring. And by the way, just to throw it out there, writing an MCP in Spring Boot is like 20 minutes exercise. It's elegant, it's easy, it's the same tools that we already know. All right, so that was a great build-up towards the framework, towards Embable. Tell us everything about it.
So, Imbeable is a framework for building agentic applications on the JVM. So it targets all JVM developers, but particularly those who are using Spring. And so what it is a significantly higher level framework than Spring AI. So it introduces more abstractions, but it's about building agentic flows. It's one of the key ideas, which I think is novel on any platform, is that the first step with Imbeable is a planning step. So rather than, for example, in Crew AI, you essentially have sequential execution with nesting, with LangChain or LangGraph, you wire up a state machine. Imbeable doesn't work like that. It works at a higher level. So what it does is knows about actions, goals, and agents. So agents define actions and goals. Goals have preconditions that must be met for them to succeed. Actions have preconditions and expected postconditions. This enables Imbeable to use a non-LLM AI algorithm for planning. So it uses a pathfinding algorithm to take you from your present world state to the goal that is chosen. There's a number of advantages on this. Very
interesting.
One of the advantages is that the system is capable of doing things that weren't programmed, but it's capable of doing only safe things that weren't programmed. So imagine if you try to build a plan by, say, choosing the execution plan using an LLM.
Okay.
Then you run into the same problems that it's opaque. Why did it choose that thing? I don't know. There's 300 billion parameters in there. Not really going to be able to
why we ended up with this plan and not the other.
So, that's one extreme. The other extreme is you code up the plan yourself with a state machine and the like, and then you get the problem that it can never do things that you didn't anticipate. And also changing it, extending it's going to require rewiring a lot of changes.
And then rerun basically everything every time.
So the big idea behind Imbeable is that there's a kind of middle ground where planning is done using AI, but planning is done using a very different kind of AI. The algorithm that it uses is called GOAP, or Goal-Oriented Action Planning. So it's essentially a pathfinding algorithm that looks at preconditions and expected postconditions and can plan from your current world state to the goal. The beauty of this is it can tell you why it made that plan, and it is deterministic. You give it the same world state and the same goal another time, it will formulate the same plan.
It's refreshing news.
Yes. So after it formulates the plan, then it starts running the first action. It runs the first action in the plan. Once it's run the first action, it determines the world state again and replans, because actions and goals have preconditions. Preconditions are absolute. If your precondition, if you have a certain precondition, that can never execute or be satisfied without that precondition. However, postconditions, expected postconditions, are actually, we're hoping for a side effect. Did that happen? Hopefully.
Might happen,
we don't
might
know.
not.
And also, it's quite valid for the postconditions, the expected effects, not to occur without error. So, for example, you might try to extract a certain data structure from a given input.
And
you can't do it. Maybe it's not an error. Maybe you just try another plan. So the other interesting thing it can do is potentially plan around failure. There may be multiple ways to get to a goal, and it can try one, find it doesn't work, and then find another
one. Not this data source, but other data source without you programming the if-else.
Exactly. So that's the core idea behind Imbable, and that idea, I believe, is novel in agent platforms. And the goal here is not to build the best agent platform on the JVM. The goal is to build the best agent platform. And so we've got big plans. The other things that I think are very interesting about it is, hardly going to be surprising, integrates with Spring very closely. If you're a Spring developer, you will be able to build an agent flow with Imbable as easily as you can build a Spring MVC application.
Which makes sense, because in the end of the day, it's all the same component abstractions.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of what do you do with them, and if you feed them to Embable by marking the actions and the goals, the precondition and the postconditions, everything else is framework work that happens behind the scenes.
Exactly. And of course, in terms of the portability between calling different models, we build on the great work of Spring AI. That also is why Babel has great MCP support, because of Christian Zolof's hard work on Spring AI MCP. So we've been very fortunate to be able to build on the Spring model. But yes, so if for a Spring developer listening to this, I'm sure they've probably written the MVC REST controller. And they can just see that code. They do @controller. They have their get and other annotated methods that have parameters that have a special meaning. So, and because they annotated something with @controller, that's what we call a stereotype annotation. So that's automatically injected by Spring. If they depend on some service over here, it's injected. So in Babel, it's @agent. @agent will be picked up by Spring Boot. It will be injected. It's a Spring component.
It's a stereotype because it has @component on the annotation, so it's inherently component as every other component. So all the binary solution works.
Absolutely. And also then you have @action methods, and their parameters have a special meaning. So for example, @action methods typically have one or more domain classes as parameters, types as parameters, and a single return type. So that enables, in the majority of cases, Embable to infer the preconditions and postconditions through the flow through. So typically you don't have to, the way I described how the planning system works, typically you don't need to actually specify those conditions, because the framework will infer them. The planning approach, as I mentioned, is called goal-oriented action planning. It's the second most popular, one of the two most popular algorithms used for controlling non-player characters in games. So even though it's something that most enterprise developers have never heard of, I'd never heard of it.
I never heard of it.
When I first read about it, it reminded me of a very old algorithm I learned about in computer science, which was general problem solver that goes back to the 50s. But GOAP in gaming is along with behavior trees, is incredibly popular for controlling non-player characters. So, I say to enterprise developers, you may not have heard of GOAT, but you've almost certainly been killed by a GOAT AI.
This is brilliant. Nice. Well, you know what? Thanks to Spring, it just makes sense, right? It's exactly the same model. It's very similar to controllers. Everything just works, and the flow underneath makes it deterministic, which is absolutely awesome.
Yes. And also another thing, it benefits, I think, from a lot of great things that Spring makes possible. Another thing that is really important is unit testing. So the story with Embable, with both unit and integration testing, is very good. So with unit testing, obviously you can't unit test how the LLM responds to a particular prompt. But what you can unit test is, do you have the right data elements in your prompt?
Correct.
Do you have you correctly specified the tools, the MCP tools that you need? Have you
bring what you wanted it to bring?
Have you specified the hyperparameters? You can totally unit test that. You can also, because these things are Spring Beans, you can unit test all your code actions, because many actions are just code. You can just unit test them like you unit test any other Spring service. So, I think that's a really important element. There's also an integration testing capability where it will actually run the flow and it mocks up LLM responses. So, and that actually can be quite useful.
And obviously the returns from services and what's not are also can be mocked easily. Okay, so in the end of the day, I can plug LLMs in those actions that make sense for LLM actions and program something deterministic and hard-coded as much as I like in other actions that I actually prefer not to let the monkeys loose.
Absolutely. So this, I think, gives you a great deal of control over where you use tool calling. As I said, I really don't believe that we should be trying to solve problems by letting a God LLM loose on 200 tools. So what you can do, for example, is distinguish between tools you're happy for your LLM to use and tools you may not want them to use. So for example, in a number of things such as the coding agent, that's an example, there are cases where the LLM only gets read access to the file system because the file tools are divided into read and write tools. And so where it pops up to an action, and if it's going to write, it's able, for example, to verify that the build succeeded before it did.
All right, let me tell you what I've been working on lately and how, and I think Babel can really help. So my idea is something that will guarantee that by the end of the flow, the code that is written is 100% aligned with the intent that we had when we put the request. And this thing is a chain. I call it intent integrity chain. This chain is built from 4 pieces. The first is formulating the prompt, which to the best of our knowledge, our ability expresses the intent. And then we let LLM, proper language model, to generate specs out of this LLM, Gherkin specs or any other specs. Now, this is where we need to verify that it did the right thing, because it's probably not. But since this spec is readable, we can actually read through it and check if our intent is well captured. Now, there are 2 benefits of that. The first, our prompt might be not good enough, and we can catch it in the intent, or the monkeys hallucinated, and we still catch it in the spec. But once the spec is approved by us, we need deterministically compile the spec into tests. And this is done by no LLM, of course. We want it as far as possible from this process because it's deterministic. And then we want to make sure that those tests are locked and read-only, and let LLM run as much as it wants until it satisfies the tests. Once we have that, we can be 100% sure that what's written in the code is exactly what we asked in the prompt, or at least exactly what we verified in the spec.
I absolutely think you could do that with Imbeable.
Right.
So, in fact, like a good place to look would be there is the Imbable coding agent repository on GitHub under Embable. And what that does is take a request for a modification, attempt to make the modification, then it will build the project. So it pops up to an action to build the project. Then, if there's a build failure, it sets a particular condition, and that drives a kind of loop where it tries to resolve that build failure. So I would think that would be similar to what you're describing.
Yeah, that's like the last piece. Like we have read-only tests, run the build as much times as possible until the test passed. But the read-only artifacts, that's exactly that. Once I generated the tests, I want them read-only. Yes, I don't want the monkeys to mess with it.
Yeah.
But so that's like another step, and also the deterministic steps. Basically, running Cucumber is the way to compile the Gherkin spec into the tests.
And so that is the kind of thing where you really want that to be in an action.
Exactly.
Where you want it. So I think this is an excellent example of why this kind of thing is important. There are other things, of course, that you can do with actions by popping up that way. One is, of course, you can have long-running processes where, for example, with Imbable, when we run an agent, we have an instance of what we call an agent process. So an agent process can be in a number of states. It can be running, where it's happily running, it's going through steps, still working. It can be definitively failed. It can be stuck, where it is unable to find a plan from the present world state. So, for example, if you download it and ask it to find news that's relevant to your star sign, it will know how to do that because there's a simple demo that does that. There's an agent that does that. If you say, what was that Adam Sandler movie, can I have a new Porsche for $0? It will say, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that. Because there's no way to go from the world state to no goal. So in that case, you have what we call a stuck handler. So potentially you might be able to resolve it, but you can see what the gap is. But so, we've got running happily, we've got waiting, definitively failed, we've got stuck. We've also got waiting on user input. So for example, it could be that the flow is not in a failed state, but it cannot proceed until it gets user input.
And that's exactly what we need after it generated the spec and we read through it and we actually try to determine if it catched our intent perfectly or not.
So the way we would model that is that when it's waiting for user input, it will essentially throw a form back to the user in a independent representation that you can render in different UIs. Currently, there's only support for rendering it to the CLI, but obviously we will add support for Discord, Slack, the web, and the like. So the idea is that it can pop up back to the user, and it can just sit there for as long as the user comes back.
And then all I need to do is go to my Git repository where the specs were committed. The first version or whatever, the 10th version, review it and then go back to whatever interface and say, this looks good, or no, it doesn't. And what happened if I say it doesn't?
So you would probably get to a situation where you are pumping an event into the system. And so the system's in a wait state, an event comes into it. The event might either cause it to be able to be unstuck and progress, or the event potentially might lead to recognizing it's impossible to achieve the goal.
And then what we need to go back in our scenario is back to the drawing board and rephrase the prompt that we started with.
Yes.
And then again, we do it until we say yes, and then it continues to the non-deterministic state of generating tests. Tests become a domain object, which I mark as read-only, and then I have an action, take those tests, make them pass, run the build tool as much as needed until you're done.
So, I mean, one of the things that I'm very committed to is what I call extreme dog feeding. Actually, piece of Spring trivia is the term dog fooding in terms of eating your own dog food
Yep.
in software actually comes from Paul Moritz, who was the CEO of VMware, who was responsible for VMware acquiring Spring. Paul came up with that term when he was at Microsoft in the 90s. So my take on this for this project is that I really believe that AI is a game changer for productivity.
Absolutely.
So like if you're a developer, you have to be augmented. If you're a marketer, you have to be augmented. So our philosophy is that we want to be as augmented as possible, but we're not going to use any commercial or third-party AI tools. So, I mean, obviously we'll use third-party models.
Yeah, the models.
But so, for example, we have our own coding agent, which it's early days, but it's already useful, and it's written in Imbable. It's open source. Hopefully, people will be able to benefit from it and contribute to it. I presented at Cotlin Conf yesterday morning. And I presented using a slide deck that was generated by an agent.
Oh, wow.
So written, open source, it's in the repository. So,
excellent. I need to take a look for it for the next conference. I think, frankly, the integration with tools, even for writing code, is way underutilized. Speaking about Kotlin Conf and JetBrains and the amazing work that they do, they have the best IDE in the world. Is their agent uses the facilities of its IDE? It's just treating it as a text editor.
That is actually, yes, that is interesting. I would have thought that you could do more. I actually would have assumed that the folk at Modern should be trying to expose their stuff as MCP tools. I mean, I think you could do some pretty interesting things. Actually, talking about Kotlin Conf and JetBrains reminds me of something that's worth pointing out, which is that Imbable is written, 90% of Imbable is written in Kotlin. And this is principally because I prefer writing Kotlin to Java. But also, there really isn't a trade-off. So, we've gone the extra mile to ensure that if you're building an agent application in Java, you literally don't need to know it's in Kotlin. There are no KT imports. It's entirely idiomatically Java.
It makes a lot of sense, and both Kotlin and Java make it a reality, and because once you have it, you have an option of writing the application in Kotlin or Java, and it will be, again, absolutely transparent what you choose.
I think it's absolutely critical that developers have that choice. I would certainly encourage developers to look at Kotlin because I think it's great. But, I understand there are very, very good reasons why many developers continue to use Java and why most of the community continue to use Java. And also, we've got to recognize that what has happened with the Java team in the last few years is very positive. I mean, Java is getting better.
Closing the gap, for sure.
So, we are very committed to ensuring that if you're a Java developer, you don't have to think about Kotlin at all. Just use it, write it in Java. Your Java will be idiomatic. And it is amazing how easy that is. I saw some KT imports that I didn't like. I thought, no, if I'm a Java developer, I wouldn't like that. So I then, in the context of fixing that, I realized there's a little bit more you need to do when you pull in that piece of string. But it ended up with, I would say, 300 lines of Java code. And that's it. Now it's completely
clean, and it looks like Java from the outside.
Absolutely looks like Java. In fact, one of the core examples there is both the Java and Kotlin version. And the Java version looks pretty much as nice as the Kotlin version.
Brilliant. Rod, thank you so much. I think last piece of information for the folks at home is where do we find all this goodness?
So Babel is open source, Apache license, just like Spring. It's available on GitHub. The organization is Imbable, Embabel. So we have just gone public this week. It is already quite usable. I mean, there's obviously a lot of work to be done, and hopefully, it would be great if some people listening to this end up contributing. I would be very grateful.
That's an amazing opportunity, I think,
yeah.
to participate in such a timely and profound open source project.
I truly believe that this could be a very important project on the JVM.
Yep.
What I want to do is, go beyond playing catch up with the Python ecosystem. I think this is an opportunity to build the best agent model. And I think it's also an opportunity to unlock tremendous business value.
Yeah, excellent. Rod, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. I learned a lot. We all learned a lot. And thank you all for watching the verbose mode by TaxCare at Spring IO 2025. I'll see you all in the next conference. We're going to do it. I hope to see you as well on the next conference.
That was a lot of fun.
And maybe we'll talk once more on the verbose mode. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.